At my sister's engagement, Dad announced, "I'm giving my entire CEO position and inheritance to your sister. You're just a secretary. You get nothing." My sister smirked. "Go make us some coffee, dear." I smiled, pulled out my tablet, and said, "As the majority shareholder, I just fired the entire board, including you." The room went dead silent. "My name is Maya Harrington. I am 32 years old. I hold a degree in finance and corporate law. For the last 8 years, I have worked as an executive assistant, a secretary, as my father always preferred to call it at Harrington Group, the company my father built from a single warehouse in 1989. I want to be precise about something before I tell you what happened. Not approximate. Precise. On the evening of April 14th, at my sister Clarissa's engagement party, a catered event at the Alderton Hall, attended by 63 guests including 3 board members, a company attorney, and a court reporter I had arranged to be there quietly. Introduced to everyone as a college friend, my father, Richard Harrington, stood up in front of the room, tapped a fork against his champagne glass, and announced that he was giving Clarissa everything. His title, his equity, his succession plan, his legacy. He turned to me while the room was still applauding and said, with the warmth of a man closing a perfectly acceptable deal, "Maya, you've been invaluable. You're an excellent secretary. You'll continue in that role. But the inheritance, the position, the equity that belongs to Clarissa now." Clarissa looked at me across the room and smiled, the smile a person gives when they've already won. She leaned slightly forward and said, softly enough that only the people nearest to us could hear, with the casual ease of someone speaking to a member of the catering staff, "Could you be a darling and get us some coffee? We'll be celebrating for a while." A few people near her laughed. Light, social, unconscious. I set my champagne glass on the table. I reached into my evening bag. I pulled out my tablet. And I said, "Before anyone gets coffee, I have a small announcement of my own." The room went dead quiet. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed everything for my family, for the company, and for me. But before I walk you through that night, I need to take you back 8 years to the day I took a job that everyone thought was beneath me, and why that turned out to be the most strategic decision I ever made. If this story is hitting somewhere familiar, if you have ever been handed a role that nobody thought mattered, if someone has ever looked past you and missed everything you were, take a second and subscribe. Not for me, for you. Because this story is about what happens when the person they never took seriously finally decides to speak. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Harrington Group started as a materials distribution company. Concrete aggregates, steel reinforcements, prefab panels for commercial builds. By the time I graduated college, it had grown into a mid-sized regional corporation with 4 divisions, 91 full-time employees, and annual revenues approaching $38 million. My father had built it with his hands, his instincts, and a complete inability to take no for an answer. He was good at it. He was genuinely, legitimately good at it. He just had one blind spot. He confused charisma with competence, and he confused affection with merit. Clarissa has always been the one who made rooms warmer. She walks in and people turn toward her the way plants turn toward light. She is 4 years younger than me. Growing up, she was the one my parents brought to work dinners, company events, the charity galas. Not because she was the oldest or the most qualified, because she was the easiest to show off. I was the one who stayed home and read the quarterly reports. Not because I was told to, because they were there on the kitchen counter and I wanted to understand what the numbers meant. When I graduated at 22 Finance and Corporate Law, summa cum laude, 2 academic awards and an offer from a consulting firm in Chicago, my father sat me down in his study. I remember the room exactly. Dark wood paneling, a portrait of the original warehouse behind his desk, a crystal decanter of scotch he never opened because he didn't drink. "Maya, the company needs a good executive assistant. Someone I can trust completely. Someone who understands the business from the inside." I waited. The consulting firm will still be there in a few years. Come work with me first. Learn from the ground up. Be useful. Be useful. I turned down the Chicago offer. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that a year, maybe 2, watching how a real company operated from the center of it, would be worth more than any MBA. I told myself my father saw something in me that he was trying to develop, not something in me that he was trying to manage. I was wrong about the last part, but I was right about everything else. Because the desk outside my father's office turned out to be the single best vantage point in the entire building. From that desk, I processed every contract, every vendor agreement, every land acquisition, every bank covenant, every shareholder communication. I drafted letters my father signed without reading. I sat in on board meetings as note-taker and learned that 3 of the 5 board members had not read the financial statements they were approving. I organized the annual shareholder filings. And in the course of organizing those filings, I began to understand, in precise detail, the structure of the company's equity. Harrington Group was privately held. My father owned 58% at the time I started. The remaining 42% was distributed among a group of early investors, 2 of whom had retired, 1 of whom was in poor health, and 1 of whom, a man named Warren Petch, had been quietly trying to exit his position for 2 years without my father noticing. I noticed. I also noticed, in my second year, that the company had taken on a short-term bridge loan to cover a cash flow gap during a slow construction season. To service that loan quickly, my father sold off a block of shares to a private investor group he knew socially, people he trusted, not people who were watching the equity carefully. That sale reduced his ownership to 51%. He didn't seem concerned. He still controlled the company. He still had the majority. 1% above the threshold is still above the threshold. What he didn't calculate, and what I did, on a legal pad in the break room on a Tuesday in November, was the exposure that created if even a small further dilution occurred, or if someone else began quietly consolidating the minority positions. Someone like me. When my grandmother on my mother's side passed away, I was 25. She left me something in a private trust managed by a separate attorney, not the family attorney. Her own attorney, a woman named Adaize Obi, who had handled her affairs for 20 years and who called me the week after the funeral to explain the terms. My father assumed the inheritance was modest. He asked once, casually, at a family dinner, "Your grandmother's trust anything useful in there?" I said, "Some jewelry and a small amount of savings." The jewelry was real. The small amount was $460,000, accumulated over 30 years of careful, silent saving by a woman who never once talked about money at the dinner table. She had known exactly what she was doing. She left it specifically to me, with a note that Adaize read aloud in her office on a gray November morning. The note said simply, "For the one who is always paying attention, do something with it that they'll remember." I sat in that office for a long time after Adaize finished reading. Then I asked her if she could recommend a corporate attorney. The holding company was called Northleaf Capital LLC. I chose the name because it sounded like a real estate investment vehicle, boring, invisible, the kind of name that makes people's eyes skip over it in a document. I incorporated it in a neighboring state. I was the sole member. My name did not appear on any public-facing document connected to Harrington Group. I made my first share acquisition 3 months after the holding company was formed. It was a small block, 0.8% of issued shares, purchased from one of the retired original investors who wanted liquidity before a family vacation. He sold privately, quietly, for a price slightly above market valuation. He was pleased. I was patient. I went back to work the next Monday and filed a shareholder communication my father had dictated to me the week before. He initialed it without reading it. Year 2. Year 3. I bought when prices dipped. I bought when investors wanted out. I bought from Warren Petch in 3 separate transactions over 14 months, his entire remaining position. Warren was delighted. He had been trying to exit for 4 years. Northleaf Capital made the process easy, professional, and quiet. I drafted Warren's farewell letter to the board. My father asked me to write something warm. I wrote something warm. By the end of my 6th year at Harrington Group, Northleaf Capital held 23% of the company's issued shares. By the end of year 7, 38%. In the spring of my 8th year, a major institutional investor decided to exit a portfolio that included a small position in Harrington Group. The block was significant 13.6% of issued shares, and they wanted a fast, clean transaction. They came to the company's attorney looking for an interested buyer. The attorney mentioned it to my father, who said he didn't have the liquidity to absorb it personally, but would make some calls. He asked me to draft the outreach emails. I drafted the outreach emails. I sent them. I also, through Northleaf Capital and a separate broker, made an offer on the block the same afternoon. The transaction closed on a Thursday. After settlement, Northleaf Capital held 51.4% of Harrington Group's issued shares. I was the majority shareholder of my father's company. I told no one. I went home, made dinner pasta, a simple tomato sauce, and sat at my kitchen table and thought about the note my grandmother had left me. Do something with it that they'll remember. I wasn't ready yet, but I was close. Clarissa's engagement to Daniel Whitmore was announced at a Sunday dinner 6 weeks before the party. Daniel's family ran a competing logistics firm smaller than ours, but well-connected socially. My father shook Daniel's hand for what felt like a full minute. This is the kind of partnership that builds something lasting. He meant the engagement. He also meant the business. In my father's world, those things were always the same sentence. I congratulated Clarissa. I meant it. She was happy. That was real. 2 weeks before the engagement party, my father called me into his office and closed the door. He sat down behind his desk and looked at me with an expression I had seen him use in difficult negotiations, warm on the surface, resolved underneath. I've been thinking about the succession plan. I want to talk to you about it before I make any announcements. I waited. Clarissa and Daniel, this is a good match. Not just personally, strategically. The Whitmore family has relationships we don't have. Social access, regional contacts. I think she should step into a leadership role at the company. Something visible, something with real authority. I looked at him. What role are you considering? CEO. When I step back, which I'd like to do within the next 2 years. He paused. You'll still be essential, Maya. You know this company better than anyone. You'd be her support, her right hand. Exactly what you've always been to me. Exactly what you've always been to me. I held his gaze for a moment. I understand. Thank you for telling me. I left his office. I went to my desk. I opened my laptop and checked the shareholder registry one more time, the way you check a locked door after you've already tested it twice. Still locked. Still mine. Then I called Adaize Obi and told her it was time. Adaize had been ready for 2 years. We had drafted the relevant documents carefully, revised them 3 times, and reviewed them against the company's founding charter, a document I had helped draft as my father's executive assistant. 7 years earlier, Article 7 of that charter gave the majority shareholder the unilateral authority to appoint and remove the board of directors. It was a standard protective clause, inserted at the request of the original investors, designed to protect them from a hostile management scenario. It had never occurred to anyone that it would one day protect me. I also contacted a court reporter named Susan Crane, who came highly recommended by ADEs. I explained what I needed: a professional witness, present at a private event, documented as a personal guest, available to certify any oral statements made by company officers in the presence of multiple witnesses. Susan agreed. I introduced her to Clarissa as an old friend from college. She wore a cream blouse and brought a gift off the registry. She also had a small digital recorder in her purse. The morning of the engagement party, I got dressed carefully. Not to compete with Clarissa, that was never the point. I chose a dark navy dress. Simple, clean. The kind of dress that reads as composed rather than dressed up. I put the tablet in my evening bag. I drove to Alderton Hall alone. I arrived early enough to find my seat and watch the room fill. Alderton Hall was warm and gold that evening. String lights across the ceiling, long tables with cream linen, flowers, white roses, and eucalyptus on every surface. The kind of event that photographs beautifully and costs more than it looks like it costs. 63 guests. I had counted the RSVPs. I knew exactly who was in that room. 3 board members, Howard Gale, seated near the front left, Patricia Mendez near the window, Douglas Chain, who had been on the board since my father's second year in business and who still thought of me primarily as Richard's girl. The company attorney, Marcus Webb, seated at a round table near the bar. He had reviewed the founding charter the previous autumn when my father had briefly considered a minor amendment to the governance structure. He knew Article 7 existed. He had never considered who might invoke it. And Susan Crane, my court reporter, seated 3 tables from the stage, smiling pleasantly over a glass of white wine. Clarissa arrived with Daniel at 7:15. She was radiant in a way that was entirely genuine. She was happy. She loved him. She was the center of something wonderful. I watched her work the room. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. That was real. I had never begrudged her that. What I had begrudged, quietly, for 8 years, was the assumption that warmth and charm were the only things worth being good at. My father called for attention at 8 o'clock. He tapped his fork against his glass, a sound that rippled across the room like a stone, across still water, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet for a man who has never once had to ask twice. He spoke for 6 minutes. I timed it. He talked about family, what it means to build something and have people to leave it to. He talked about Clarissa's warmth, her instincts with people, her ability to walk into a room and make it better. He talked about Daniel's family and the bridge their marriage would build between 2 good businesses. His voice was full and certain, the voice of a man who believed completely in what he was saying. Then he turned the tone. Just slightly. The way you turn a dial rather than a switch. A company is only as strong as the leadership it trusts. Clarissa has always understood people in the way that a company like ours needs. She understands relationships. She understands loyalty. She understands what it means to carry a name with pride. A small round of applause. Clarissa pressed her hand to her chest. So tonight, I'm making it official. When I step back and that conversation has already begun, Clarissa Harrington will be my successor as Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Group. The company I built will pass to the person I know will carry it forward. Louder applause. Daniel beamed. Several of the older guests nodded with the particular satisfaction of people who believe the world is continuing in the correct direction. Then my father found me across the room. Eye contact, brief, deliberate. Maya, you have been invaluable. You are an excellent secretary. The company would not run without your dedication, and that will not change. But the leadership, the equity, the inheritance, those belong to Clarissa. That is my decision, and it is final. He raised his glass. The room raised its glasses. And Clarissa, glowing, radiant, entirely in her moment, turned to me with the lightness of someone who has never once had to consider the floor beneath their feet might not hold, and said, gently, warmly, without a single ounce of malice, because it required none, "Could you be a darling and get us some coffee? We'll be celebrating a while." The table nearest to her laughed softly. A kind laugh, really. The laugh of people who think everything is settled. I looked at my sister. I felt something shift inside my chest, not anger, not the sharp heat of humiliation, but something much quieter and much more final. The specific feeling of 8 years arriving at a single point. I set my champagne glass on the table. I reached into my evening bag. I took out my tablet. I stood up. If you have ever been told your no is a suggestion, if someone has ever handed you a role and assumed that because you accepted it quietly, you accepted it permanently, I need you to hit subscribe right now. Not for the algorithm, for the reminder that patience is not the same thing as surrender. Okay, let me tell you what happened next. The room was still mid-applause when I stood. A few people near me glanced over, not alarmed, just curious. A guest standing up at a celebration is unremarkable. I waited, quietly, with the patience of someone who had been waiting for 8 years and was not going to rush the last 30 seconds. The applause faded. People began reaching for their glasses. I said, calmly, clearly, at a volume designed to carry across the room without raising. Before anyone gets coffee, I have a small announcement of my own. The room stilled. My father looked at me with an expression that was not yet alarmed. I was his secretary. I organized events. Perhaps I had a toast prepared. Perhaps this was a kind gesture. Marcus Webb, the attorney, set his glass down. I turned the tablet so it faced outward, toward the tables. The screen showed the shareholder registry of Harrington Group, a document I had prepared and certified with ease that morning. Clean, formal, time-stamped. At the top of the document, Northleaf Capital LLC, and beside it, the number that had been 8 years in the making. Maya. Northleaf Capital LLC is a holding company I formed 7 years ago. As of last Thursday, it holds 51.4% of Harrington Group's issued shares. That makes me, as its sole member and managing director, the majority shareholder of this company. Silence, not the soft silence of a pause in conversation. The hard silence of a room full of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood. My father's face did something I had never seen it do in 32 years. It went still, not angry, not sad. Still, like a man who has just heard a number that doesn't reconcile with any ledger he has been keeping. Howard Gale, the board member seated at the front left, leaned forward. Douglas Chain looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was looking at the tablet with the focused expression of an attorney reading a document he wishes he had read earlier. Under Article 7 of Harrington Group's founding charter, a document drafted in this company's second year of operations, the majority shareholder holds the unilateral right to appoint and remove members of the board of directors, effective upon written notice. I tapped the screen. The next document appeared. Notice of board dissolution. Signed, dated, witnessed by Adaiz Obi. I served that notice this morning. The current board is dissolved as of tonight, all pending succession arrangements, equity transfers, and inheritance designations tied to the company's governance structure are void until new board appointments are confirmed. Clarissa's hand was still in Daniel's. She was looking at me. The warmth had not left her face. It had simply stopped being a smile and become something else, something uncertain. My father found his voice. It was quieter than I had ever heard it. Maya, what is this? It was not a question. It was the sound of a man who knows exactly what it is and needs one more second before he has to say so out loud. This is the company, Dad. The one I've been running from a desk outside your office for 8 years. The one whose contracts I drafted, whose board meetings I managed, whose share structure I understood better than anyone in this room. This is what I was doing while you were deciding I was support staff. The room did not move. 63 people, and not one of them reached for a glass or turned to their neighbor. The string lights kept their warm glow across the ceiling. The white roses sat perfectly still on the tablecloths. Somewhere near the back of the room, Susan Crane, court reporter, personal witness, old college friend, had her hand resting quietly on her purse. My father stood up. He was a tall man, and the room had always responded to his standing. It conveyed authority. It conveyed intention. He stood, and he looked at me the way he had looked at me across his desk. The afternoon, he asked me to be useful. You cannot do this. This is my company. I built it. You built it. That is true, and I have never once taken that from you. But I own it. That is also true. And those two things can both be true at the same time. I will contest this. Marcus. He turned to his attorney. Marcus Webb looked up from the tablet he had taken from my hands and been reading for the last 40 seconds. He looked at my father with the careful expression of an attorney who has just found the clause that changes everything. Richard, Article 7 is unambiguous. I drafted it. The majority shareholder has this authority. If the shareholder registry is accurate, it has been certified by an independent corporate attorney and is available for your review. Marcus said nothing else. He set the tablet on the table and sat down. Howard Gale pushed back his chair. Patricia Mendez had her phone in her hand, screen lit. Douglas Chain, the oldest board member, the one who had been there since the beginning, looked at my father with an expression that was not surprise. It was, strangely, something closer to recognition. Clarissa spoke. Her voice was steady, steadier than I expected, and I want to acknowledge that. She was not the one who had made the choices that brought us to this room. She was the one who had been handed things her entire life, which is a different kind of damage. Maya, did you plan this? Tonight, at my engagement party. I looked at my sister. I had prepared an answer for this question. I had prepared many answers for many questions. But when I looked at her face at the genuine hurt underneath the shock, I chose the true one instead of the strategic one. I planned the legal part for years. The timing, yes. I chose tonight because it was the first night Dad was going to make a public announcement. I needed it to be public, so it couldn't be privately undone. That is the truth. I am sorry for how it landed for you personally. Clarissa looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at our father. Then she looked at Daniel. She picked up her champagne glass, turned it slowly in her hand, and set it back down without drinking. She did not speak again for a long time. The party did not end dramatically. There was no shouting, no overturned tables, no moment of cinematic collapse. What happened was quieter and, in many ways, harder. People began leaving. Not all at once, not a stampede, but in the gradual, polite dispersal of guests who sense that the event they came to is no longer the event that is happening. Goodbyes were short. Daniel's mother hugged Clarissa for a long time near the door. Howard Gale and Patricia Mendez left together, phones already out. Douglas Chain stopped beside me on his way out. He was 71 years old. He had built things with my father a long time ago. He looked at me with an expression that I will spend a long time thinking about. Your father is going to be very angry for a very long time. I know. He's also going to be fine. He built a company. The kind of person who builds a company doesn't stop being that because the ownership changed. He shook my hand formally, deliberately, the way you shake the hand of someone you are now taking seriously, and walked out. My father sat at his table for a long time after most people had gone. My mother, who had been seated 3 tables away and had not said a word since my announcement, came and sat beside him. She did not look at me. I did not go to them. Ade's Obi arrived at 9:45, as we had arranged. She sat with Marcus Webb for 40 minutes at the bar, reviewing documents over mineral water. I watched them from a chair near the window. Marcus came to find me at 10:30. The documents are in order. Northleaf Capital's position is uncontestable under the current charter. You understand your father will almost certainly seek legal counsel to challenge the board dissolution. I know. I've prepared for that. Adaze has the full file. He looked at me for a moment, not with hostility, with the particular look of someone reassessing a calculation they thought they had already completed. You drafted Article 7. I was the one who typed it. He nodded, slowly. You knew what it meant. I've known what it meant for 7 years. He picked up his briefcase. He walked to the door. Then he turned back. For what it's worth, the share acquisition was clean. Every transaction, properly documented, arm's length. If your father challenges this, he will not win on the merits. He left. I sat alone for a few minutes in the emptying room. The caterers were clearing tables. The string lights were still on. One arrangement of white roses had shed a few petals onto the cream linen. I had not gotten anyone coffee. My father did not call me that night. He did not call me the next day. My mother called Sunday morning at 7:40. I was making coffee, actual coffee, in my own kitchen, in my own apartment, when my phone lit up with her name. I answered. She said, "How could you do this to him, Maya? At your sister's engagement, in front of everyone." I had prepared for this too. Not the words, you cannot prepare the exact words, but the ground beneath them. The place I was going to stand while she spoke. Mom, I didn't do anything to him. I exercised a legal right I have spent 8 years acquiring. The method was deliberate. The timing was deliberate. What happened at that party was exactly what would have happened in a lawyer's office. Except in a lawyer's office, it would have been easier for Dad to rewrite the story afterward. Silence. He is your father. He is also the man who looked me in the face 2 weeks ago and told me I would always be support staff in the company I own. My mother did not respond to that. She said she needed time. I told her I understood. We hung up. I drank my coffee. I went to work. The office on Monday morning was the strangest professional experience of my life. I arrived at 8, which was my usual time. I sat at my desk outside my father's office, which was empty. He had not come in. His assistant, the backup assistant, hired 2 years ago when the company expanded. A young man named Brendan, who was efficient and good-natured, looked at me with an expression that told me he had seen the news. Harrington Group was not publicly traded, but in a regional business community, news moves. 2 board members had made calls. Someone had talked. Maya, there are 3 lawyers calling for your father. Route them to Marcus Webb's office. He's aware of the situation. And the board meeting request from Howard Gale? I thought for a moment. Tell him that as acting majority shareholder, I'll be in contact within 48 hours to discuss interim governance structure. Brendan wrote it down. He handed me my messages. He poured me a cup of coffee without being asked, without comment, with the quiet professionalism of someone who has just recalibrated his understanding of the room and went back to his desk. I sat at my desk outside my father's empty office and opened my laptop and began the work of running a company, which was, in almost every practical sense, what I had been doing for years. My father came in on Wednesday. I heard him before I saw him, the specific sound of his walk in the hallway, a pace I had learned, the way you learn a piece of music you've heard every day for 8 years. He opened his office door, went in, and closed it without looking at my desk. I gave him 20 minutes. Then I knocked, opened the door, and walked in. He was at his desk. He looked older than he had on Saturday. Not because of anything dramatic, just the particular way that a person looks when a version of the world they had built in their mind has been revised overnight. I sat in the chair across from him. The chair where I had taken notes for 8 years. I'm not here to take your office, Dad. I'm not here to push you out. I want to tell you what I actually want, if you'll listen. He looked at me. He didn't speak. I took that as permission. I want to restructure the governance so that decisions are made by people who understand the business. I want to bring in 2 independent board members with real operational experience. I want to take a formal executive role, something with actual authority and accountability, not a desk outside your door. And I want a succession plan that is based on who is best for the company, not on who makes the best impression at a dinner party. Long silence. Why didn't you just tell me any of this? Years ago. I looked at him. Because every time I gave you my analysis or my opinion or my recommendation, you would nod, tell me it was very good, and then do exactly what you were going to do anyway. And because the one time I asked you directly, my first year here, if there was a path for me to move into a leadership role, you told me to be patient and be useful. So I was. Both of those things. Very deliberately. He was quiet for a long time. The share acquisition. You used your grandmother's money. And 8 years of my own salary. And 4 years of watching minority investors quietly look for exits and being the only person in the building paying close enough attention to know when they were ready to sell. He looked at his desk, at the portrait of the original warehouse behind him on the wall. She always liked you best. Your grandmother. She liked that I paid attention. Clarissa called me 10 days after the party, not to argue. She asked if she could come over. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of wine she had clearly spent time choosing, and a slightly rehearsed expression that softened into something real within the first few minutes. We sat on my couch with our glasses, and she looked around my apartment, which she had never once visited in the 3 years I had lived there, and said, "I didn't know you lived like this." Like what? Quietly. Neatly. Like someone who has everything where they need it. I didn't know what to say to that. So I didn't say anything. She told me she had been angry, that she had spent the first 3 days after the party genuinely furious, not because she had lost something she understood she had earned, but because she had never once considered that the ground could move, that the thing she was standing on was not guaranteed. That was the shock, not the loss, but the revelation that loss was possible. I kept thinking, when did you start? When did you know? I started about 7 years ago. I knew from pretty much the beginning of working there that Dad saw the company as something to give, not something to merit. I just made sure I was positioned when the time came. But you could have just told us. You could have said something. I thought about how to answer this honestly. What would have happened if I had? If I had walked into Dad's office 5 years ago and said I'm acquiring shares through a holding company and I intend to be majority shareholder, what would he have done? She was quiet. He would have offered me a different title and a raise, and he would have found a way to buy back or block the shares. And then he would have made the same announcement at your engagement party. But without the Article 7 filing. Clarissa looked at her wine. He's really angry, Maya. I know. Are you going to fight him? I'm going to run the company. I'm going to give him a role that respects what he built. And I'm going to let him be angry for however long he needs to be angry. But no, I'm not going to fight him. I already won. She laughed. I had not expected the laugh. It was short and surprised, and underneath it, I heard something that sounded, finally, like the beginning of honesty between us. You're kind of terrifying. I'm patient. It looks like the same thing. She stayed for 2 hours. We finished the wine. We talked about Daniel, about the wedding, about what she actually wanted to do with her life, beyond the role that had always been assigned to her. Those answers were more complicated and more interesting than either of us expected. When she left, she hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the social kind. It was the first real hug we had exchanged in a very long time. I am going to tell you where things stand, and I am going to tell you the truth, not the version that makes everything clean. My father and I have a working relationship. It is formal and careful, and underneath its formality, there is something that I think is slowly becoming respect. Not the reflexive respect of a father for a child, but the more complicated respect of two people who have finally seen each other clearly. He has not apologized. I have not asked him to. What he has done is show up every morning, do his work, and defer to me on the decisions that now require my sign-off. That deference costs him something. I know it does. I watch it sometimes, the small pause before he presents a recommendation, the moment of recalibration in his expression when I ask a question he wasn't expecting. It is not easy for a man like my father to recalibrate, but he is doing it. That tells me something about who he actually is, underneath the version of himself he had been performing for 30 years. The board has been reconstituted. 2 independent members with operational backgrounds, one from manufacturing logistics, one with a finance and M&A background. Howard Gale returned. Patricia Mendez returned. Douglas Chain, who turned 72 in January, stepped back by his own choice and sent me a handwritten note that I have put in my desk drawer. The note said, "Your grandmother would be pleased. So would the woman who typed Article 7. I have not framed it, but I have not thrown it away either." Clarissa did not take a role at the company. That was her choice, made freely and, I think, with considerable relief. She is working with an arts nonprofit that Daniel's family supports, doing the thing she is actually extraordinary at, walking into rooms full of people and making them feel something. She is good at it. I have never begrudged her that. I am glad she finally gets to do it without it being attached to a succession plan. My mother called last week. We spoke for 22 minutes. It was the longest conversation we have had in 3 months. She did not apologize either. What she did was ask me genuinely, with the particular hesitation of someone learning a new language, what I am working on at the company, what problems I am trying to solve, what I find difficult. I told her about a vendor renegotiation that has been taking longer than expected. She said, "That sounds hard." It was 2 words, but they were real words. I said, "It is, but I know what I'm doing." She said, "I know you do. I think I always knew." We hung up. I sat at my desk, my new desk, in my new office, with my name on the door, and stared at the wall for a while. It is a Tuesday morning. The coffee in my mug is still warm. Through the window of my office, I can see the original warehouse my father built, the one from the portrait behind his old desk, which now hangs on the wall of the conference room where the board meets. It is still standing, a little weathered, solid. I have been thinking about what I want to say here, at the end of this story. Not the summary, the meaning, the thing that is true beyond the facts. For 8 years, I was invisible by design, not their design, mine. I understood, early and clearly, that the people who get handed things are the people who perform wanting them loudly. And I did not want to perform, I wanted to build. I wanted to know. I wanted to understand the structure of the thing so thoroughly that when the moment came, there would be no argument to make because the argument had already been made in documents, in registries, in legal filings, in 8 years of showing up and paying attention when everyone else was looking the other way. My father built a company because he believed in it. That is genuinely admirable. I acquired that company because I believed in it too, and because I also believed in myself. quietly and without announcement, for long enough that it became irrefutable. There is something I have thought about a great deal since that evening at Alderton Hall. It is not the announcement. It is not the silence in the room after I said the number. It is the moment, earlier in the night, when my father turned to me after making his speech and said the words he meant as a compliment, "You've been invaluable. You're an excellent secretary." He meant it kindly. He genuinely did. And that, I think, is the hardest part to hold. Not the people who dismiss you out of malice, those are straightforward to navigate. The harder ones are the people who love you and still cannot see you. The people who look at everything you are and translate it into something manageable. Something that fits the story they have already written. My father never asked me what I thought. He never asked me what I wanted. He asked me to be useful, and I was more useful than he ever understood, in more ways than he ever knew to look for. I stopped waiting for him to ask. That was the beginning of everything. I'm not going to tell you that everything is resolved. My father still pauses sometimes when he passes my office. My mother is still learning how to talk to the version of me that exists outside the role she had assigned. Clarissa and I are building something slowly, genuinely, that did not exist before the engagement party, a relationship between two adults who finally see each other. Instead of two daughters performing the parts they were cast in, that is not a clean ending. It is an honest one. What I know is this. The desk outside the door was not a consolation prize. It was a classroom. It was a vantage point. It was the place from which I could see everything, every contract, every vulnerability, every opportunity that passed through unexamined, because the people who were supposed to be paying attention had decided I was furniture. Furniture holds up the room. That has always been true. What changed is that I stopped pretending the room was not mine. If someone in your life is asking you to make yourself smaller so they can feel larger, if they are handing you a role and calling it a compliment and expecting you to be grateful for the limitation, I want you to hear this. Clearly, you are not support staff in your own life. You are the majority shareholder. Act like it. I have one question for you, and I mean it, so please answer it in the comments. What did you see, clearly and for a long time, that the people around you were too comfortable to look at? Tell me. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about people who were underestimated, who paid attention, who chose the long and quiet and certain path, check the description below. There's a whole collection there. Thank you for being here for this one. It means more than you know.